In 1963, a man in central Turkey was renovating his house. Nothing unusual about that. People knock down walls, dig new rooms, expand their homes all the time. But when this man broke through a wall in his basement, he didn't find pipes or wiring or old storage space. He found a tunnel. Dark, narrow, carved from solid rock, leading down into the earth and seemingly into nothing. Curious, maybe a little uneasy, he kept going, and the tunnel kept going too. Down past one level, then another, then another. What he'd stumbled into wasn't some forgotten cellar or a hole dug by a previous owner. It was the entrance to an entire city built beneath his ordinary house. A city with room for thousands of people, hidden so completely that the families living above it for generations had no idea what was sitting beneath their feet. That city is called Derinkuyu, and what researchers eventually uncovered still doesn't quite make sense, even decades later. We're talking about a subterranean complex that plunges roughly 85 meters into the ground, spread across at least 18 distinct levels, though some researchers believe there could be more still unexplored. Wide enough, deep enough, and complex enough to shelter an estimated 20,000 people at once. Not for an afternoon, not for a single night of hiding. For extended periods of survival, completely cut off from the surface world. Think about the sheer scale of that for a second. 20,000 people is roughly the population of a small modern town. Now imagine fitting that many human beings underground, with enough air to breathe, enough water to drink, enough food to eat, and enough space to sleep, worship, and simply exist without descending into chaos. That's not a bunker. That's not a basement. That's an entire civilization designed to vanish into the rock whenever the world above became too dangerous to survive in. And that's really the question that hangs over everything here. Why? Why would an entire community pour this much labour, this much ingenuity, this much sheer human effort into building a place whose entire purpose was to disappear? People don't carve 18 levels into solid volcanic rock for fun. They don't design ventilation shafts, wells, stables and chapels underground because they're bored. Something or someone made the surface unsafe enough that going underground made more sense than staying up in the sunlight. As we go deeper into this story, and I do mean deeper, we're going to walk through what archaeologists actually found down there. Massive circular stone doors, some of them weighing hundreds of kilograms, built so that a handful of people on the inside could seal off an entire corridor against an army trying to get in. Wells drilled straight down through multiple levels, so no one would ever have to risk stepping outside for water. Underground chapels carved directly into the rock, where people prayed in near-total darkness. Even spaces for livestock tucked into the upper levels, so the city could sustain itself for as long as it needed to. But maybe the biggest question of all is this. Was Derinkuyu built for one specific catastrophe? A single terrifying event that forced people underground all at once? Or was it something else entirely? A city shaped slowly, generation after generation, by people who lived under the constant grinding threat of danger for hundreds of years. We're going to dig into both possibilities, and honestly, the answer might be more unsettling than either option on its own. If you're listening to this right now, I'd love to know where in the world you are and what time it is for you. I get comments from literally every time zone on Earth, and there's something kind of amazing about all of us tuning into the same ancient mystery from completely different corners of the planet. So drop a comment and let me know. And if you're enjoying stories like this, the best way to support what I do here is to follow the show on Spotify, listen there, and if you're liking it, leave a 5-star review. The link's right down in the description. Now, let's go back to that basement wall in 1963, because what happened right after that discovery is even stranger than the tunnel itself. So let's rewind to that moment. A man in the town of Derinkuyu, in the heart of Cappadocia, is doing what homeowners have done for centuries. He's trying to fix up his house. Maybe he wanted more storage space. Maybe a wall was crumbling and needed to be torn out and rebuilt. The details of exactly what he was doing that day have gotten a little fuzzy over the decades, the way these origin stories always do once they turn into legend. But the core of it stays the same. He knocked down a wall, and instead of finding the back of his basement, he found open space where there shouldn't have been any. Now, if you've ever done any kind of home renovation, you know that unexpected gaps behind walls are usually not exciting. It's mould. It's a dead rodent. It's some previous owner's questionable plumbing decision. Nobody opens up a basement wall expecting to find a passage that keeps going. But that's exactly what he found, a narrow opening, carved not by nature but by human hands, leading downward into darkness. He could have sealed it back up right there. Plenty of people would have. But he didn't. He grabbed a light and he went in. What he found on the other side of that wall wasn't a small hidden room or a forgotten storage pit. It was a tunnel cut straight into volcanic rock, sloping downward with a kind of purpose that immediately told him this wasn't natural. Natural caves don't have smooth walls and consistent width. Natural caves don't have niches carved at regular intervals or floors levelled out for walking. This was engineered. Somebody had planned this, shaped this, and then, for reasons nobody could yet explain, sealed it off and let generations of families live directly above it without a clue. He followed the tunnel, and it led him to another chamber. And that chamber led to another passage, and that passage opened into something larger, something that felt less like a hole in the ground and more like a room, then a hallway, then what could only be described as a network. The kind of layout you'd expect from a small village, not a basement expansion project. At this point, you have to imagine what was going through this man's head. He's standing in the middle of what's clearly not a wine cellar, not a storage cave, not anything he has a category for. He's essentially wandering through the skeleton of an abandoned city, alone underground, with nothing but a light source and a growing sense that he's stumbled onto something far bigger than his house. Word got out, as it always does in small communities, and eventually researchers and archaeologists made their way to Derinkuyu to see what exactly this homeowner had broken into. And what they found didn't just confirm his suspicion that this was more than a cellar. It blew that suspicion completely out of the water. As they explored further, tunnel after tunnel, chamber after chamber, level after level, they realized they weren't looking at an isolated hiding spot or a single family's emergency bunker. They were looking at an entire underground settlement. Multiple stories deep, connected by shafts and staircases and corridors, with distinct sections that seemed to serve different purposes. Areas that looked like they'd been used for living quarters. Others that looked like storage. Still others that had the unmistakable feel of communal gathering spaces. This wasn't a hole somebody dug in a hurry. This was infrastructure. Somebody, or more accurately, many somebodies across a long stretch of time, had carved out an entire world beneath the surface, with all the complexity that implies ventilation, water access, multiple points of entry and exit, defensive features. This was a city that had been built to function, not just to exist. Now, here's where things get a little more official, though still surprisingly limited compared to what you'd expect for a discovery this massive. After the initial exploration in 1963, Turkish authorities began a more structured excavation of the site. Over the following years, teams worked to clear out collapsed sections, map out the levels that were accessible, and remove centuries of debris and sediment that had built up in some of the passageways. By 1969, just a handful of years after that homeowner broke through his basement wall, Derinkuyu was open to the public. Think about that timeline for a second. from accidental discovery to public tourist site in under a decade. That's fast, especially for a site of this scale and complexity. Compare that to other major archaeological discoveries, ones that take generations of careful excavation before anyone's allowed near them, and Derinkuyu's timeline looks almost rushed. Which raises an interesting point that we'll come back to later. Was the exploration thorough, or was it more about making a fraction of this massive complex safe and accessible, while the rest remained essentially untouched? Because here's the thing, what opened to the public in 1969, and what's still open to visitors today, is only a portion of the complex. Estimates vary, but most researchers agree that only a limited number of the confirmed levels, somewhere around 8, are open for public exploration. Remember, this site is believed to extend at least 18 levels deep, possibly more. That means well over half of Derinkuyu remains off limits, either because it's structurally unstable, unexcavated, or simply too dangerous for regular foot traffic. And that's not because nobody's interested in exploring further. It's because the deeper you go into Derinkuyu, the more the environment fights back. Some passageways have partially collapsed over the centuries, blocked by rockfall or sediment that would take significant time and resources to clear safely. Other sections are narrow enough that modern equipment can't easily get through, meaning any further excavation would essentially have to be done by hand, the same way the original tunnels were carved. And then there's the simple issue of structural integrity. This is a city carved into volcanic rock nearly 1,000 years ago, at minimum, possibly much older. Reinforcing and stabilizing untouched sections for public access, or even for safe archaeological work, is an enormous undertaking. There's also a more basic mapping problem, because Derinkuyu isn't a single simple structure. It's a sprawling, interconnected network that seems to link up with other underground settlements in the region. Tracing its exact boundaries has proven incredibly difficult. Tunnels that researchers thought were dead ends have later been found to connect to entirely separate passageways. Some sections seem to double back on themselves, others branch off in directions that don't seem to lead anywhere obvious, at least not yet. So when people ask how much of Derinkuyu has actually been explored, the honest answer is, we don't fully know. What's open to tourists is almost certainly just the surface of a much larger, much older, and much stranger structure than anyone initially expected. Decades after that homeowner broke through his basement wall, we're still not entirely sure how deep this rabbit hole goes, literally. And that uncertainty is exactly why Derinkuyu continues to pull in researchers, historians, and curious minds from around the world. Because every answer we get about this place seems to open up 2 or 3 new questions, starting with one of the most basic and most puzzling of all. How and why did a landscape like Cappadocia become the perfect place to build a hidden underground world in the first place? The answer starts with fire. Not the kind of fire you make in a hearth, or the kind that lights a tunnel when the power goes out. We're talking about volcanic fire. Millions of years before anyone thought about carving a room, digging a tunnel, or hiding an entire community beneath the ground, central Anatolia was one of the most violently active landscapes on Earth. Cappadocia sits on a high plateau in what is now central Turkey, surrounded by the remnants of ancient volcanoes. Mount Erciyes, Mount Hasan, Golu Dağ. These weren't distant mountains providing a nice view. Over millions of years they erupted again and again, throwing out ash, lava, pumice, and volcanic debris across an enormous area. Some eruptions were explosive enough to blanket the landscape in hot clouds of ash and gas. Those clouds settled, cooled and hardened into thick layers of volcanic rock called tuff. And tuff is the reason Derinkuyu exists, not in the sense that the rock magically turned itself into a city. Thousands of people still had to do the backbreaking work. They had to choose where to dig, cut the chambers, haul out the rubble, reinforce vulnerable areas, plan the shafts, and somehow make the whole thing livable. But without Cappadocia's geology, the project might have been impossible, or at least so difficult that nobody would have attempted it on anything like this scale. Because tuff has an unusual combination of properties. When it is freshly exposed, it can be relatively soft. Soft enough to cut with simple hand tools, iron picks, chisels, hammers, even harder stones in earlier periods. You don't need explosives, you don't need modern drilling equipment. You need labour, patience, and the ability to keep removing rock one basket at a time. But tuff is not just loose ash. Over time, volcanic ash compacts and cements together. It becomes solid enough to hold a carved space, especially when builders understand the material and leave enough rock in the right places. They could hollow out rooms, corridors, storage chambers, stables and ventilation shafts while preserving thick pillars and supporting walls. They weren't digging through dirt that would collapse behind them. They were sculpting usable spaces directly out of the landscape. Think about what that means. In most places, building a shelter means finding materials, cutting timber, making bricks, hauling stone, raising walls, putting a roof over everything, and hoping the whole structure survives the weather. In Cappadocia, the roof was already there. The walls were already there. The builders simply had to remove what they didn't need. It was construction by subtraction, and above ground, that same process created one of the strangest landscapes on the planet. Cappadocia's famous valleys, with their towering rock spires and cone-shaped formations, weren't designed by people. They were carved by erosion. Rain, wind, freezing temperatures, and flowing water gradually ate away at the softer tuff. In some places, harder layers of basalt or other volcanic rock sat on top like protective caps. The softer rock beneath eroded faster, leaving behind tall columns topped with darker stone. These are the formations people now call fairy chimneys, although the name makes them sound whimsical enough to distract from how violent the process really was. This landscape is constantly being made and unmade. A cliff face can erode, a chamber can crack, a rock dwelling that lasted centuries can suddenly become unsafe after water seeps into a fracture, and winter freezing does the rest. Cappadocia gave its inhabitants an almost perfect building medium. It also reminded them that nothing carved into it would last forever without maintenance. Still, people learned to use it in extraordinary ways. Long before Derinkuyu became known to the outside world, Cappadocia was already famous for its rock-cut architecture. Across the region, people carved houses into hillsides, dug animal shelters into the valley walls, cut storage spaces into cliffs, and created entire settlements that blended so completely into the terrain that from a distance they could be difficult to distinguish from natural formations. Then there are the churches. During the Byzantine period, Cappadocia became one of the great centres of rock-cut Christian architecture. Chapels, monasteries and churches were excavated directly into the tuff. Some of them decorated with painted frescoes that have survived for centuries in the dry, sheltered interiors. At places like Gurim, the landscape is full of rooms and sanctuaries hidden behind plain rock faces. You can walk through a valley that looks empty from a distance and discover that its cliffs contain kitchens, sleeping chambers, storerooms, stables, prayer spaces, and burial niches. The rock could become almost anything, and that changes how you think about Derinkuyu. It wasn't built in a region where underground living was some bizarre, isolated idea. It was built in a place where carving into rock was already part of daily life. A family might have a cave room, a village might have a rock-cut stable. A monastery might be hidden in a valley wall, digging deeper, creating shared storage areas or expanding an existing refuge below ground was not a leap into the unknown. It was an extreme version of a familiar local skill. Derinkuyu was extraordinary, but it was not alone. All across Cappadocia, archaeologists have identified underground settlements, tunnels, and multi-level complexes. Kaymakli, not far from Derinkuyu, is another vast underground city open to visitors today. Özkonak contains its own network of chambers and defensive features. Mukür, Tatlaren, Marzi, and other sites show that people across this volcanic plateau repeatedly chose to build down instead of out. That pattern matters. It tells us Derinkuyu was not the product of one eccentric ruler saying, "You know what this town needs?" 18 levels of underground corridors. It belonged to a wider regional tradition. Different communities, over different periods, working with the same rock and facing many of the same dangers. And perhaps most importantly, they understood the value of concealment. Above ground, a settlement can be seen from miles away. Smoke rises. Animals make noise. Fields, roads, and houses announce that people are nearby. Underground, the signs are much harder to read. An entrance can be tucked into a courtyard, hidden behind a wall, concealed inside a stable, or opened from a house that looks completely ordinary. Once inside, people could disappear beneath the surface, while the landscape above gave almost nothing away. That didn't make these places invisible in some magical sense. A large population leaves evidence. There would have been movement, supplies, waste, and the challenge of bringing animals underground. An invading force that knew exactly where to look could find an entrance. But secrecy did not require total invisibility. It only required delay, confusion, a few crucial hours in which raiders might move on, searching for easier targets, while the people they expected to find had vanished into the rock. Cappadocia offered another advantage too. Its valleys and ridges naturally broke up the landscape. Settlements could be tucked into folds of terrain. Narrow routes could be watched. Small openings could be defended. The same erosion that made the region beautiful made it complicated, full of blind corners, hidden depressions, and rock formations that could conceal far more than they revealed. But the geology imposed limits, and those limits shaped every decision underground. Tuff may be easy to carve, but it is not uniformly strong. Some layers are tougher than others, some absorb water more easily. Some fracture without warning. Builders had to avoid weak zones, leave thick supports, and understand where a chamber could safely expand and where it could not. Go too wide, remove too much rock, or cut into unstable material, and your shelter becomes a tomb. Water was another problem. The rock that made digging possible could also allow seepage. Rainwater could enter cracks. Moisture could weaken surfaces. Flooding in lower passages was a real danger. And then there was air. The deeper people went, the more every underground space depended on carefully planned ventilation. You could hide from the world above, but you could not escape the basic requirements of being human. You still needed oxygen, water, food, light, space for animals, somewhere for smoke to go, somewhere for waste to go. So Cappadocia did not hand its people an effortless underground refuge. It handed them a possibility, a landscape soft enough to carve, strong enough in the right conditions to shelter a community, strange enough to hide entrances in plain sight, vast enough to connect houses, tunnels, valleys, and whole settlements beneath a surface that looked to outsiders like nothing more than weathered volcanic stone. And once people realized what that possibility could become, they pushed it farther than almost anyone else in the ancient world. Because the next question was no longer whether a few rooms could be cut beneath the ground. It was how deep a city could go before the earth itself finally said no. The answer, according to the most commonly repeated figure, is about 85 meters, roughly 280 feet beneath the surface. That is the number attached to Derinkuyu in guidebooks, documentaries, museum descriptions, and almost every article about the site. 85 meters. deep enough that if you stood at the bottom and looked straight up, you would be looking through the height of a 25-story building made entirely of rock. But that number needs an asterisk, because Derinkuyu is not a clean, simple hole in the ground. It is not one elevator shaft dropping from street level to a clearly defined basement floor. It is a tangled, three-dimensional complex of corridors, rooms, stairways, ventilation shafts, wells, storage areas, stables, churches, defensive passages and chambers, whose original purposes are still debated. Some spaces are open, some are blocked, some have collapsed. Some may never have been fully explored, and some tunnels appear to run beyond the areas accessible today. So when people say Derinkuyu goes 85 meters deep, what they usually mean is that the known excavated complex reaches approximately that depth below the modern surface. Known is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Visitors do not walk all 85 meters through every level of the city. The tourist route follows only a controlled portion of the underground network. It has to. These passageways can be narrow enough that two people would struggle to pass shoulder to shoulder. In places, the ceiling drops low. The stairs are uneven, polished by centuries of use and later excavation. There are shafts descending into darkness, side passages closed by gates, and rooms that are simply too fragile or too dangerous to open to thousands of people every day. What you see on a visit is Derinkuyu, but not all of Derinkuyu. And even archaeologists have to be careful about what they mean by all. The city was not necessarily created as one perfectly planned project. It seems to have expanded over long periods, with new rooms cut from old rooms, older passages reused, entrances altered, and different sections adapted as needs changed. Imagine a house where every generation adds another room. Then imagine that house is underground. Then imagine the additions continue for centuries, perhaps longer, until the whole thing becomes less like a building and more like a maze that has grown inside the earth. That is Derinkuyu. The vertical organization is what makes it so astonishing. Near the upper levels there were spaces connected more directly to the world above. Areas where people could enter, bring down supplies, possibly keep animals and move quickly if danger was approaching. Then the city descended in stages. Stairways led into corridors. Corridors opened into chambers, chambers connected to new stairways, shafts, and narrow choke points. The deeper you went, the more removed you became from daylight, weather, and the sounds of the surface. But this was not just a descent into darkness. It was a descent through a system. At different levels there were places for food storage, places associated with wine or oil production, kitchens, living rooms, stables, communal spaces, religious spaces, ventilation channels, wells. The underground city had to function as more than a hiding place. A few people can crouch in a cave for a night. Thousands of people with children, elderly relatives, food stores, animals, tools and water needs require something closer to infrastructure. And Derinkuyu had infrastructure. Its stairways were not all broad ceremonial staircases. Many are steep, narrow, and deliberately awkward. They force people to move single file. That might sound inconvenient, because it was, but inconvenience can become a weapon when strangers are trying to force their way in. A defender who knows every bend and turning point has an enormous advantage over someone entering from the light above, ducking through a passageway with no idea what waits around the next corner. The corridors also did not simply plunge straight downward. They twist, branch, narrow, and connect different zones. This made the city more manageable for the people inside, but more confusing for anyone outside. A settlement above ground spreads across a landscape. Derinkuyu stacked that landscape vertically. Instead of streets moving outward, there were routes moving down, inward and across. Think about the logistics. Food had to be carried underground. Water had to be accessed or stored. Animals had to be moved through passages that were sometimes barely wide enough for humans. Smoke from cooking had to be controlled. Waste had to go somewhere. And all of this happened inside a structure carved from stone, where a mistake in planning could turn a refuge into a death trap. Which brings us to the famous population estimate. Derinkuyu is often said to have sheltered as many as 20,000 people. Sometimes the claim is phrased even more dramatically. 20,000 people, plus livestock, plus food supplies, all sealed beneath the surface while danger passed overhead. It is an extraordinary number, and it may be possible. The known volume of the complex is enormous. There are enough chambers, storage spaces, and service areas to show that Derinkuyu was built for a community far larger than one household or one small village. The presence of stables is especially important. Animals were not an optional extra in a pre-modern society. They meant transport, milk, meat, labour, warmth, and survival. If people were taking livestock underground, they were preparing for more than a quick hiding place. They were preparing to endure, but 20,000 should not be treated like a precise census figure. Nobody found a carved stone tablet saying, maximum occupancy, 20,000. The estimate is based on the size and layout of the known spaces, comparisons with other underground sites, assumptions about how densely people could shelter, and the practical possibility of storing enough food and water. Change those assumptions, and the number changes too. How much room did each person need? Were all chambers occupied at once? Were some sections used mainly for storage, animals, worship, or defence? How long were people expected to stay below ground? Hours? Days? Weeks? Did every level function at the same time? Or were some parts abandoned, sealed, or repurposed over the centuries? We do not know, and that uncertainty matters because 20,000 people underground is not just a big number. It is a claim about organisation. It implies that Derinkuyu could coordinate food, movement, ventilation, security, and basic human survival on the scale of a small city. Not a spontaneous panic shelter. Not somewhere people ran because they happened to find a hole in the ground. A place maintained, supplied, understood, and probably rehearsed. Even if the true number was lower, the achievement remains almost impossible to comprehend. 10,000 people would still be extraordinary. 5,000 would still be extraordinary. A few thousand people with animals and provisions concealed beneath an apparently ordinary settlement would still represent one of the most ambitious survival systems ever carved by human hands. And the deeper you think about it, the stranger Derinkuyu becomes. Because depth was not just about making more room. Every metre downward made the city harder to discover, harder to attack, and harder to abandon in a hurry. But every metre also made life more dependent on the shafts, tunnels, and hidden systems that connected the people below to the world above. Going underground gave them protection. It also gave them a problem that could kill everyone inside if the air stopped moving. But air was only one part of the equation. Even with a way to breathe, Derinkuyu would have been useless if the people inside had nowhere to sleep, nowhere to prepare food, nowhere to keep animals, and no way to make limited supplies last. A tunnel is a hiding place. A city is something else. And Derinkuyu was built to be something else. Walk through the known levels and you do not find one enormous underground hall where thousands of people could simply crowd together and wait. You find a system of smaller spaces, rooms cut into the tuff, low chambers connected by corridors, niches, platforms, storage cells, work areas, and passages that seem almost too cramped to be useful until you remember what they were designed for. Not comfort, survival. The soft volcanic rock of Cappadocia made this possible. It was firm enough to hold a carved room, but workable enough that generations of people could enlarge a chamber, add a passage, create shelves in the walls, or cut a new storage space when an older one was full. Derinkuyu was probably not built in one grand burst of construction. It appears to have grown over time, shaped by changing needs, changing threats, and generations who understood that the ground beneath their homes could be more valuable than the homes themselves. That growth explains why the city feels less like a palace designed from a blueprint and more like a living organism. Rooms lead into rooms. Corridors bend unexpectedly. One chamber might have been used for storage in one period and shelter in another. A passage that once gave easy access may later have become a defensive bottleneck. The city adapted because the people using it adapted, and every part of that underground world had a job. There were residential chambers where families may have gathered in tightly packed groups. These were not spacious apartments in any modern sense. They were compressed spaces, built around the reality that a refuge does not need to feel like home forever. It needs to keep people alive until they can go home again. That distinction matters. If Derinkuyu was mainly used during periods of danger, then people did not need private rooms with wide floors, windows, or permanent domestic comfort. They needed protected places where bodies could be kept out of sight and out of reach. Parents with children, elderly people who could not flee across open country, neighbours bringing blankets, tools, grain, water containers, and whatever they could carry before the entrances were sealed. The rooms could be crowded because crowding was temporary. Unpleasant, certainly. Exhausting, almost certainly. But better than being found above ground by raiders, soldiers, or anyone else whose arrival turned the surface into a place of danger. And the layout suggests that this crowding was organised. Rather than funneling everyone into one vulnerable central space, Derinkuyu distributed people across multiple chambers and levels. That made practical sense. Families could remain together. Supplies could be stored away from sleeping areas. Animals could be kept apart from food. Movement could be controlled. If one passage was blocked, other parts of the complex might still function. If an intruder broke into an upper section, people farther down could retreat through the network. This was not architecture for a panicked stampede. It was architecture for managed occupation. The storerooms are especially important. A refuge survives only as long as its food does, and in the ancient world, food security often meant grain. Grain could be dried, carried, stored, ground, rationed and turned into meals long after fresh food was gone. It was compact compared with its value. It could sustain a family through a bad season, an army through a campaign, or a hidden community through a period when going outside was too dangerous. Derinkuyu contains spaces associated with storage, and their presence changes the whole meaning of the site. These were not people hiding with whatever happened to be in their pockets. They had places to stockpile provisions, grain, dried foods, perhaps legumes, preserved fruit, wine, oil, and animal fodder could all have been brought below or kept ready near the entrances. The exact contents of every chamber cannot now be reconstructed with certainty. Organic materials vanish. Containers break. Centuries of reuse blur the evidence. But the basic logic is impossible to miss. People expected shortages. They prepared for them. And storing food was only the first step. Grain has to be processed. It has to be cleaned, crushed, ground, mixed, cooked, and divided among people who are frightened, tired, and trapped in close quarters. Archaeologists have identified areas that appear connected to food preparation and production. There are spaces interpreted as kitchens. There are installations associated with pressing grapes or processing other agricultural products. There are work areas where daily labour could continue below the surface. That last part is easy to overlook. We imagine hiding as passive. You enter a shelter, close the door, and wait. But thousands of people cannot simply wait. Someone has to distribute food. Someone has to care for animals. Someone has to grind grain. Someone has to bring water. Someone has to watch the entrances. Someone has to manage children, illness, injuries, waste, arguments, and fear. In a crowded underground refuge, the mundane tasks of life do not disappear. They become more urgent. A handful of people can survive on cold food for a day or two. A large community needs systems. That is why communal workspaces matter. They suggest that Derinkuyu was not simply a place where individual families vanished into separate holes in the rock. It was a coordinated environment. Labour could be divided. Supplies could be managed collectively. Knowledge of the passages, wells, storerooms, and defensive doors had to be shared. Somebody or some group had to know how the whole thing worked. Imagine arriving as danger approached. You do not wander randomly through a dark maze looking for an empty room. You go where your family has gone before. You bring grain to the storage area. You take animals toward the stable level. You know which route remains open and which passage will be closed. The people who built and maintained Derinkuyu may have used it repeatedly enough that this movement became almost routine. Not pleasant, never casual, but practiced. And then there are the ceilings. In some underground spaces, ceilings and walls are blackened with soot. That darkness is physical evidence of fire used below ground. Lamps, torches, hearths, cooking fires, perhaps all of them at different times. Soot does not tell us exactly who stood in a room, what they cooked, or how long they stayed. It cannot give us a neat diary of underground life, but it tells us that these chambers were not empty stone cavities. They were lived in. People needed light because darkness underground is absolute. Once you move beyond the entrance, there is no moonlight filtering through cracks. No dawn, no changing sky. A lamp becomes more than a convenience. It becomes orientation. It tells you where a corridor begins, where a stairway drops, where food is kept, where your family is sleeping. Lose the light in a maze like Derinkuyu, and familiar space becomes dangerous in seconds. Fire also meant warmth, especially during the cold winters of central Anatolia. It meant cooked grain, hot broth, and food that could be shared. But it also created a problem. Smoke accumulates. Flames consume oxygen. A city underground could not fill every room with open fires, without turning its own refuge into a suffocating trap. So the soot-blackened ceilings reveal something larger than cooking. They reveal planning. Fire had to be used carefully. Cooking areas had to be positioned where smoke could be drawn away. Lamps had to provide enough light without poisoning the air. Even the location of a kitchen was not just a domestic choice. It was part of the city's survival engineering. The animal spaces reveal the same level of preparation. Stables have been identified in the upper portions of the complex, where moving livestock in and out would have been easier. That placement makes sense. Animals were valuable, but they were also difficult underground. They needed fodder, water, space, and air. They produced heat, noise, and waste. Bringing them below ground was a logistical burden, which is exactly why it is so revealing that people did it. Livestock were not merely possessions. They were future food, milk, transport, labour, and wealth. Leaving animals on the surface could mean surviving an attack only to emerge with nothing left to rebuild a life. Taking them underground meant that the community was trying to preserve not just human bodies, but the economic foundation that kept those bodies alive. Derinkuyu was designed around that kind of calculation. How much grain can be stored? How many animals can be moved inside? Which rooms can hold families? Where can food be prepared? How can people pass through narrow corridors without blocking one another? What happens if the stay lasts longer than expected? These are not the questions asked by someone digging a hole to hide in for an afternoon. They are the questions asked by a community preparing for the unthinkable. And yet all of this depended on one system more delicate than walls, storerooms, or stone doors. You can stockpile grain, you can crowd into chambers, you can keep lamps burning and doors sealed, but if fresh air does not reach the depths, none of it matters. Derinkuyu's greatest engineering achievement may not have been the rooms where people lived. It may have been the invisible network that made living underground possible at all. That invisible network begins with shafts. At Derinkuyu, archaeologists have identified an extensive system of vertical openings cut down through the volcanic tuff, connecting upper levels to chambers far below. Some are narrow, some descend for many meters. Some were clearly designed to move air. Others may have served as wells, access routes, communication channels, or all of these things at different times. And that is the first part of the mystery. A ventilation shaft sounds simple. You cut a hole from the surface downward, and fresh air enters. But Derinkuyu was not a single basement. It was a deep, branching complex of rooms, corridors, storage areas, stables, and defensive passages. Air had to travel through a city with multiple levels, sharp turns, sealed doors, and spaces potentially crowded with people and animals. Getting air underground is easy. Getting enough air to keep a hidden community alive is something else entirely. The shafts appear to have worked as a network rather than as isolated holes. Air entering from different points could circulate through the upper chambers and descend toward lower levels. Temperature differences between the surface and the underground spaces may also have helped create natural airflow. Warm air rises, cooler air sinks. In a carefully connected system of shafts and passages, those differences can produce a slow but continuous movement of air. Slow is the important word. Derinkuyu was not mechanically ventilated. There were no fans, no pumps, no metal ducts forcing clean air into every room. Everything depended on the shape of the carved spaces, the placement of openings, the wind above ground, temperature changes, and the ability of the people inside to manage how they used the refuge. A wrong decision could have consequences. Seal too many passages and you improve security but reduce airflow. Keep too many fires burning and smoke begins to gather. Pack too many people into one chamber and the air becomes heavy, damp, and depleted. Bring animals too deep into the complex and the problem becomes worse. Every breath uses oxygen. Every lamp flame uses oxygen. Every cooking fire turns a little more of the available air into smoke and carbon dioxide. The city had to breathe, and the people inside had to understand how to let it breathe without revealing themselves to the world above. Some ventilation openings may have been concealed or positioned, so that they did not advertise the full scale of the complex below. But concealment has limits. Air moving through shafts can carry smells. Smoke can rise. Voices can travel. A hostile force standing near an opening might not know exactly what lay beneath its feet, but it could notice signs that someone was hiding underground. This turns ventilation into a security problem. The very system that kept the city alive could also betray it. Then there was water. One of Derinkuyu's most remarkable features is its deep central shaft or well system, descending roughly 55 meters in some accounts. It is often described as a ventilation shaft, but it also appears to have had a vital connection to water access. And in an underground refuge, water was as dangerous a problem as air. Food can be rationed, hunger is terrible, but people can endure it for days or even weeks. Water is different. A community of thousands would need it constantly. Drinking water, water for cooking, water for children, the sick and the elderly, water for animals. and perhaps water for the basic cleaning needed to prevent disease from spreading through crowded chambers. The builders of Derinkuyu seem to have understood that any water source connected directly to the surface could be vulnerable. An enemy might poison it, block it, guard it, or simply wait beside it for desperate people to emerge. So parts of the well system may have been designed to be accessible from within the city, while being controlled or cut off from the surface. The exact arrangement is still debated, because Derinkuyu was altered and expanded over long periods. A shaft could be adapted, a passage could be blocked. A well used in one era might serve differently in another. But the principle is clear. Secure water was not a luxury below ground. It was the difference between a refuge and a tomb. And this is where the popular claim that Derinkuyu sheltered 20,000 people becomes difficult to evaluate. The number is repeated everywhere because it captures the scale of the place. Derinkuyu is enormous. It contains enough carved space to make the idea of a vast underground population seem possible. But possible is not the same as proven. The true number would have depended on which levels were open, how much food and water had been stored, whether animals were present, how long people needed to remain below, and most importantly, whether the ventilation system could support that many breathing bodies. 20,000 people do not disappear underground without changing the environment around them. They produce heat, moisture, waste, carbon dioxide, noise. They need light, water, food, and somewhere to sleep. Even if every chamber were packed, even if airflow reached the deepest levels, the underground city would have become increasingly difficult to inhabit as days passed. That does not mean Derinkuyu could not shelter very large numbers during emergencies. It means the refuge was probably used according to rules we can only partly reconstruct. Perhaps not every chamber held people at once. Perhaps some levels were reserved for supplies or animals. Perhaps large populations entered only during the most extreme threats, while smaller groups used the deeper spaces at other times. Perhaps stays were measured in days or weeks rather than months. The architecture gives us the system. It does not give us a schedule, and smoke remains one of the hardest questions. The blackened ceilings show that fires burned underground. But how many? For how long? Were kitchens placed near shafts so smoke could rise out? Did families cook only at certain times? Did they rely heavily on prepared food, cold food, dried grain, bread, cheese, or preserved supplies to avoid filling the city with smoke? We do not know. Oil lamps would have been safer than large open fires in some spaces. But lamps still consume oxygen and produce fumes. Torches are useful for movement, but terrible for air quality if hundreds of people carry them through narrow passages. A large cooking fire might feed many people, yet it could make an entire level unlivable if the air was still. This was survival engineering at its most unforgiving. Above ground, smoke disappears into the sky. Below ground, it stays with you. It settles into ceilings. It follows corridors. It stings eyes and throats. It turns a shelter into a place where every breath feels borrowed. Derinkuyu's ventilation system proves that its builders planned for more than a brief hiding place. They understood airflow well enough to carve shafts through astonishing depths and connect them to a sprawling underground world. But the unanswered questions are just as revealing. How long could thousands truly remain below? How did they control fires? How did they manage waste and disease? What happened when the air turned stale? The water ran low, and the people above still had not gone away. The city could protect them from attackers, but it could never let them forget they were trapped beneath the earth. And if air was the system that kept Derinkuyu alive, its stone doors were the system that made hiding there worth the risk at all. The doors were not doors in the ordinary sense. They were enormous circular slabs of volcanic stone, carved into thick discs and positioned at the narrowest points in Derinkuyu's tunnels. Some weighed hundreds of kilograms, some may have weighed far more. Standing upright in grooves cut into the floor, they could be rolled across a passage from the protected side, sealing the corridor with a barrier that was almost impossible to move from the other direction. Picture what that means. You're moving through a tunnel barely wide enough for a few people to pass shoulder to shoulder. The ceiling is low, the walls press close around you. Then the passage narrows, and ahead of you is a stone disc filling nearly the entire corridor. No handle on your side, no obvious gap, no room to get around it. Just a wall of rock that someone inside has rolled into place. The tunnel has become a trap. This is one of the clearest signs that Derinkuyu was not simply a place where people lived underground. It was designed to control movement, to divide the complex into defensible sections, to make sure that if someone found one entrance, they did not automatically gain access to everything below. The circular shape was crucial. A square block would have needed to be lifted, dragged, or slid through a carefully cut channel. That takes strength, space, and time. But a circular stone can roll. Even a massive disc becomes manageable if it is balanced, upright, and guided through a carved track. A small group on the inside could potentially move a barrier that would be incredibly difficult for a larger group on the outside to shift. And the direction mattered. These stones appear to have been designed to close from within the refuge. The defenders had access to the side where the disc could be rolled into position. An intruder facing the sealed side confronted a smooth, heavy surface, set tightly into the passage. There was no convenient edge to grip, no open space to swing tools, no easy way to get leverage behind it. It is a simple idea, but simple ideas become powerful when the geography does the rest. A stone door out in an open courtyard can be surrounded. Attackers can work on it from multiple angles. They can bring ropes, poles, hammers, fire, or large numbers of people. Underground in a cramped corridor, all of those advantages disappear. You cannot surround the obstacle because the walls are on both sides. You cannot gather a crowd around it because only a few bodies fit in the tunnel. You cannot easily use a battering ram because there is no room to build momentum. The passage itself becomes part of the weapon. This is why Derinkuyu's defensive design is so unsettling. The people inside did not need to defeat an invading army in open battle. They only needed to make entry slow, exhausting, uncertain, and dangerous enough that the people outside gave up, moved on, or failed to reach the deeper chambers before supplies ran out. But this is where the evidence needs to be separated from the story we want to tell. The stone doors are real, the narrow passages are real. The interior placement of the barriers is real. Their defensive potential is obvious. What we cannot always prove is exactly how they were used during a specific attack. We do not have a written account saying that raiders reached this tunnel on a particular day, that families rolled the stone shut, and that enemies spent 3 days trying to break through. That scene is possible. It is not documented fact, and yet the engineering tells us what the builders expected could happen. They expected that someone might come looking. Many of these circular doors also have a small opening near the centre. These holes are one of Derinkuyu's most discussed features. They are too small for a person to pass through, but large enough to create a connection between the two sides of a sealed barrier. Their exact purpose may have varied. They could have allowed communication. Someone inside could listen for movement, speak to whoever stood beyond the door, or check whether a passage was still occupied. They may also have had a defensive purpose. A narrow central opening could allow defenders to observe the other side while remaining behind the stone. In some interpretations, it may have allowed a spear or other weapon to be pushed through if attackers tried to force their way down the tunnel. That idea is plausible, especially in a passage too confined for a direct fight. But again, plausible is not the same as proven. The openings do not preserve the memory of the hands that used them. They do not tell us whether they were used for weapons, for air, for speech, for securing a locking mechanism, or for some combination of these functions over centuries of use. Derinkuyu was not built in one afternoon by one community with one fixed plan. It was expanded, altered, reused, and adapted across long stretches of history. A hole in a stone door may have meant one thing in one period, and something slightly different in another. Still, imagine being on the wrong side of it. You have found the entrance to an underground settlement. Maybe you know people are inside. Maybe you hear faint sounds through the rock. You follow the tunnel downward, farther from daylight, farther from escape, only to reach a stone disc sealing the way. There is a small dark opening at its centre. Beyond it, someone may be watching. Someone may be listening, but you cannot see into the darkness behind them. You have entered their world, and in their world, every corridor belongs to the people who know how to close it. That is the real genius of Derinkuyu's stone doors. They did not merely block entrances, they broke the underground city into compartments. One sealed passage could protect a family group, a storage area, a well access point, a chapel, or an entire lower level. If an outer section was compromised, the refuge did not necessarily fall all at once. The people inside could retreat deeper, close another barrier, and force the intruders to begin again. Every door bought time to hide children, time to move supplies, time to carry water deeper into the complex, time to decide whether escape was possible through another route, time for those outside to lose patience in a maze that offered no easy victory. And once you understand that, Derinkuyu stops looking like a giant underground cave. It starts looking like something more deliberate. A city built around one ruthless principle: nobody enters unless the people inside allow it. And that principle did not end at the stone doors. Because a barrier is only as useful as the passage behind it. If every tunnel beyond the door opened into a wide central hall, then sealing the entrance would only delay the inevitable. But Derinkuyu's internal layout appears to have been built around a different idea. Movement should be controlled at every stage, not just at the surface. Not just at one dramatic doorway. Everywhere. Many of its corridors are low, narrow, and awkward. In places, adults would have needed to bend, crouch, or move carefully through the rock. This was not an underground palace designed for comfort. It was a landscape engineered to limit what bodies could do. And that matters more than it might seem. A wide passage lets a group move together. People can carry shields side by side. They can push forward in numbers. They can turn around quickly if something goes wrong. They can bring tools, weapons, supplies, and wounded companions through the same space. A narrow passage destroys all of that. In a corridor barely wide enough for one person, an intruding force becomes a line. The strongest person in the group is no longer protected by the people around him. He is exposed at the front, unable to move freely, unable to see much beyond the next bend. The people behind him cannot easily help. They cannot spread out. They cannot rush past him. If he falls, if he hesitates, if he encounters a blocked tunnel, everyone behind him is trapped in the same confined space. One person at a time, that is the geometry of a choke point. And underground, choke points become even more powerful because the attacker is operating blind. There is no horizon, no overview of the terrain, no way to climb a ridge and see where the defenders are positioned. Every turn hides the next section. Every drop in the floor changes the route. Every low ceiling forces people to look down when they may need to be looking ahead. The people who lived here knew the route. An outsider did not. That difference could be decisive. Imagine entering from the upper levels. At first you may find chambers, passages, signs of ordinary life. But as you move deeper, the city does not reveal itself all at once. It breaks apart into routes, levels, side spaces, shafts, and restricted corridors. A person unfamiliar with the plan could not simply march toward the centre, because Derinkuyu may not have had a single obvious centre at all. It was not organised like a town square with streets radiating outward. It was organised more like a living maze, not random. Not chaotic, but layered. A passage could lead into a chamber, then turn sharply into another corridor. A route could descend to a lower level while another branch ended at storage rooms, animal spaces or domestic areas. A narrow opening could connect one section to another while making it difficult to move people or goods quickly. And at key points, the stone doors we have already seen could divide the city into separate compartments. This is what makes the defensive interpretation so compelling. Derinkuyu was not relying on one final barricade. It appears to have used defence in depth. If the outer route was breached, the people inside could retreat behind another constriction. If that section became unsafe, they could withdraw again. The invader would not be conquering a single space. He would be entering a sequence of increasingly controlled spaces, each one unfamiliar, each one potentially sealed, each one narrowing the advantage of numbers. It is the underground version of a fortress wall behind a fortress wall. Except the walls are the city itself. The turns were important too. A straight corridor gives a person sight lines. It lets them see a threat coming. It allows a group to coordinate. In some situations, it creates room to use long weapons effectively. But a turning passage interrupts all of that. You cannot see around the bend. You do not know what is waiting there. You cannot easily throw something charge forward or even judge how far the passage continues. And if defenders were positioned beyond that turn, they had the advantage of surprise. We should be careful here. Archaeology can show us narrow tunnels, bends, barriers, and separated levels. It cannot always tell us exactly where people stood in a confrontation, what weapons they carried, or whether every turn was intentionally designed as an ambush point. Some shapes may reflect the practical limits of carving through soft volcanic tuff. Others may have developed gradually as the complex expanded over centuries. But practical constraints and defensive value do not cancel each other out. A passage can be narrow because it was easier to excavate that way and still be extremely useful in a crisis. A route can bend because it follows the best rock and still make intruders vulnerable. Over generations, builders could recognize those advantages and preserve them, extend them, or build new spaces around them. That may be the real story of Derinkuyu. Not one master architect drawing an impossibly perfect underground fortress from the beginning, but communities repeatedly adapting a hidden place to the threats they understood, digging deeper, closing one route, opening another, adding storage, creating protected areas, making sure that access to water, food, worship, animals, and sleeping spaces could not all be lost at once. Because in a refuge under threat, access is everything. Who reaches the well? Who reaches the grain stores? Who can move between the family chambers and the deeper levels? Who knows the route to a secondary exit? Who can close a passage before strangers get through? These are not abstract questions, they are survival questions. The layout suggests that different parts of Derinkuyu could be isolated from one another. If intruders entered an upper section, people farther below may have been able to block connecting routes. If one tunnel became dangerous, the rest of the settlement did not necessarily become accessible. A threatened community could pull inward, protecting its most essential spaces while abandoning less critical areas closer to the entrance. That is a brutal calculation. You do not defend every room equally. You defend the rooms that keep people alive, and some routes may have been restricted even in ordinary times. Not every opening in an underground city needs to be a public street. Certain passages may have served particular households, work areas, storage zones, religious spaces, or deeper defensive sections. Others may have led towards surface exits known only to people familiar with the system. The evidence does not let us map every access rule or identify secret escape routes with certainty. But in a place this large, with multiple levels and branching connections, knowledge itself would have been a form of power. An outsider might find an entrance. That did not mean they had found the city. They may have entered only its outer skin, and this is where Derinkuyu begins to feel less like a hiding place and more like a machine for surviving pursuit. Its cramped corridors slowed movement, its turns denied visibility. Its segmented levels prevented easy access. Its stone doors could isolate entire zones. Its restricted routes gave those inside options that those outside could not see. A refuge needs space for people, but a refuge under threat needs something more. It needs to decide who gets in, who gets through, and who is left standing in the dark. But survival is not only about keeping strangers out. It is about keeping a community together once the doors are closed. Because imagine what that meant. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people crowded into chambers beneath the ground. Families separated from fields, daylight, familiar routines, perhaps even from relatives trapped elsewhere on the surface. Nobody knows how long the danger will last. A day, a week, an entire season. Food can be stored. Water can be reached. Tunnels can be defended. But fear is harder to manage. And that is where Derinkuyu's religious spaces become important. Among the chambers identified in the underground complex are spaces commonly described as churches or chapels. One of the most notable is a relatively large, cruciform religious chamber on the lower levels, associated with Christian use of the site. It is not simply another storage room or domestic space. Its form suggests gathering, ceremony, and shared belief. In a city designed to disappear beneath the earth, there was still room set aside for worship. That tells us something essential. The people sheltering here were not merely hiding bodies underground. They were trying to preserve a way of life. Christian features found at Derinkuyu are among the clearest clues to its later history. Cross-shaped spaces, ecclesiastical layouts, and areas interpreted as places of worship point toward occupation or adaptation during the Christian and Byzantine periods, when Cappadocia had become a major centre of Christian life. Across the region, people carved churches, monasteries, chapels, tombs, and entire religious settlements into the soft volcanic rock. Derinkuyu was part of that world. But this is where the story gets complicated. A church inside Derinkuyu does not mean the whole underground city was first created by Christians. It means Christians used it, expanded it, modified parts of it, made it their own, and those are very different claims. The underground spaces at Derinkuyu may have developed over a long period, with some sections possibly far older than the visible Christian adaptations. The rock does not come with dates carved into it. A tunnel can be widened. A room can change function. A storage chamber can become a stable, a refuge, or a chapel. New communities can inherit older excavations and reshape them for threats their predecessors never imagined. That is one of the central challenges of Derinkuyu. When archaeologists identify a Christian religious feature, they can often date that feature broadly through its architecture, associated material, and historical context, but they cannot automatically use it to date every tunnel connected to it. A chapel might be Byzantine. The corridor leading to it might be older. The shaft beneath it might be older still, or they may all belong to one phase. In many cases, the evidence is not precise enough to say. The city is not a frozen moment in time. It is a layered record of people returning to the same hidden world generation after generation and leaving their needs behind in stone. Still, the Christian spaces matter because they reveal what concealment actually required. Think about life underground during a crisis. The air is dim. The rooms are crowded, children are restless, adults are exhausted. Rumours travel faster than facts. Has the enemy gone? Did anyone see them? Are the entrances secure? Is there enough grain? Is the water still safe? Under those conditions, worship would not have been a decorative extra. It could have provided rhythm, a gathering at a familiar hour, a prayer spoken together, a ritual repeated when everything outside had become uncertain, a shared language for explaining suffering, danger, loss, and hope. In a place where people had surrendered the sky, faith may have helped them hold on to the idea that the world above still existed, and that they would one day return to it. That does not mean every person in Derinkuyu was there for religious reasons. Nor does it prove that the city was built primarily to escape persecution. The evidence for Christianity tells us that Christian communities occupied and adapted parts of the complex. It does not, by itself, identify the exact danger that drove them underground at any particular time. They may have been hiding from raids, invasions, local violence, political instability, or the broad insecurity of a frontier region repeatedly exposed to conflict. Religion can tell us who some of the later occupants were. It cannot always tell us who was outside the door. But identity mattered in another way too. When a community is under pressure, shared belief becomes a boundary. It answers a basic question. Who are we, above ground, that identity might be expressed through public churches, processions, bells, festivals, graves, and visible symbols? Underground, almost all of that disappears. There are no open streets, no skyline, no public square. The community becomes enclosed within rock. So the religious chamber becomes more than a place to pray. It becomes a centre of continuity, a place where parents could teach children the stories that defined them, where elders could lead familiar rites, where people could mark births, mourn deaths, ask for protection, and reaffirm that they belong to one another. In that sense, the chapel was part of the city's defensive system, even if it had no door of stone and no narrow corridor. It defended morale, and morale is not a small thing when survival depends on cooperation. People have to share food fairly. They have to obey restrictions on water and air. They have to keep quiet when danger is near. They have to trust that someone is watching the entrances, that someone knows the routes, that someone has not taken more than their share. A frightened population can become its own worst threat. Panic, conflict, hoarding and despair can break a refuge from the inside. Shared rituals could help prevent that. They created routine where routine had been destroyed. They created order in a place built to withstand chaos. This may be why the Christian evidence at Derinkuyu feels so powerful. It makes the city human again, not just an engineering marvel of ventilation shafts, rolling stone doors and hidden passages, but a place where people tried to remain themselves while the world above became unsafe. Yet we have to keep the dates separate. The churches and Christian features are evidence for later phases of Derinkuyu's use, especially in the long centuries when Byzantine Cappadocia faced recurring instability. They show that Christian communities were among the people who relied on this underground refuge. They do not prove that the entire complex began in the Byzantine era, and they do not erase the possibility that older chambers, shafts, and passages had already existed beneath their feet. The deeper we go into Derinkuyu, the more the city resists a single origin story. It may have begun as smaller excavations, storage spaces, shelters, wells, work areas, Then, over centuries, each new generation inherited what the last had carved and asked the same question. How can we make this place safer? For Christian communities, part of the answer was clear. Do not just preserve the body, preserve the faith that tells the body why it must endure. But if Christians did not begin Derinkuyu, then who did? This is the question that turns an underground city into an archaeological mystery. People often want a single answer. The Hittites built it. The Phrygians built it. The Persians built it. The Byzantines built it. Pick one civilization. Pick one date. Put a name on the first hammer strike. But Derinkuyu does not make that easy. In fact, assigning the entire complex to any single people may be the wrong way to think about it. This was not a palace built from one plan, completed by one ruler, then sealed forever in the year it was finished. It was a system of spaces cut into workable volcanic rock, a place that could be enlarged whenever fear, population, technology or opportunity demanded it. And that kind of place can outlive almost everyone who first made it. Some early traditions and popular accounts connect underground Cappadocia with the Hittite world. That is not completely unreasonable. The Hittite Empire dominated much of central Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age, from roughly the 17th to 12th centuries BC. They lived in a landscape full of political rivals, shifting alliances, fortified cities, and military campaigns. They understood the value of defended places. They knew that Anatolia could become dangerous very quickly. So it is tempting to imagine Hittite communities cutting the first shelters into Cappadocia's soft rock, perhaps as refuges during invasion or local conflict. But tempting is not the same as proven. There is limited direct archaeological evidence tying the earliest parts of Derinkuyu specifically to the Hittites. No clear Hittite inscription tells us who carved the tunnels. No securely dated foundation deposit announces that a Hittite king ordered the work. No unmistakable layer of material culture has settled the question beyond debate. The Hittite connection remains possible. It is part of the conversation. But it is not a solved fact, and that distinction matters, because ancient sites are often more complicated than the stories built around them. After the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BC, Anatolia did not become empty. New powers emerged, old populations adapted, trade routes continued, languages changed, kingdoms rose and fell, and somewhere within that long unstable history, the first excavations that would eventually become Derinkuyu may have been expanded, deepened, and made more defensible. One group often brought into the story is the Phrygians. The Phrygians became important in central Anatolia during the early 1st millennium BC. Their culture is associated with monumental rock-cut landscapes, carved facades, tombs, and sanctuaries. They clearly knew how to work with stone, and they lived in a region where carving into the earth was not an unusual idea. Some scholars and many popular accounts have suggested that Phrygian communities may have played a role in developing early underground spaces in Cappadocia. Again, it is plausible, but the evidence is incomplete. A people's skill in rock cutting does not automatically prove that they built a particular underground city. Derinkuyu needs more than broad cultural resemblance. It needs dates, objects, inscriptions, clear construction phases. The kind of evidence that can connect a tunnel, a chamber, or a ventilation shaft to a known population at a known time. And underground sites are terrible at preserving that kind of certainty. If you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is real but the final answer stays just out of reach, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries goes much deeper into cases like this. You can find it on our website through the link in the description. Because imagine what happens to a place like Derinkuyu over centuries. A small storage pit is cut beneath a house. Then someone realizes it stays cool through the summer and dry through the winter. So they enlarge it, Years later, a family uses it to keep grain safe. Then conflict comes. A passage is extended. A door socket is carved. A chamber becomes a temporary shelter. A generation later, another crisis arrives. The shelter is no longer enough, so people break through another wall, deepen another shaft, add a stable, create a second route, connect one family's hidden room to another family's hidden room. Eventually, after enough expansions, the original structure vanishes inside the later one. The earliest tool marks may be cut away, older entrances may be blocked, floors may be lowered, walls may be reshaped. A room that once stored food may become a workshop may become a stable may become a chapel. Later occupants may remove older debris precisely because they need the space. Every renovation makes the city more useful, and every renovation can make its origins harder to see. Persian period possibilities add another layer to the puzzle. From the 6th century BC onward, much of Anatolia came under the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cappadocia was integrated into a vast imperial system, stretching from the Aegean world to Central Asia. Armies moved through the region, taxes were collected, local elites governed under imperial authority, roads and communication networks tied distant provinces together. This was a world where secure storage, protected routes, and emergency refuges could have had enormous value. Some accounts suggest that underground spaces in Cappadocia may have been used or expanded during Persian rule. That is certainly possible, but once again, use is not the same as original construction. The Persians could have inherited older chambers. Local Anatolian communities under Persian administration could have continued enlarging places their ancestors already knew. Or important phases of work may have happened later still. That is the pattern that keeps returning. Derinkuyu does not behave like a site with one birthday. It behaves like a living system, not living in the sense that people occupy every tunnel continuously for thousands of years. There were likely periods of heavy use, reduced use, abandonment, rediscovery and rebuilding. But the idea of the underground refuge survived. Knowledge of its entrances survived. The practical value of the rock-cut spaces survived. And each era had its own reason to return. A farmer may have needed cool storage. A household may have needed a hidden well. A local community may have needed protection during a raid. A later Christian population may have needed enough room for families, animals, provisions, worship, and weeks of uncertainty. By the time Byzantine communities adapted Derinkuyu on a large scale, they may have been inheriting a subterranean world already shaped by centuries of earlier use. That is why the search for a single founder can be misleading. Maybe the first excavation was Hittite era, maybe it was Phrygian. Maybe some of the oldest spaces belong to another Anatolian community whose name has not survived. Maybe different areas began at different times. The evidence does not yet allow us to draw a clean line through the rock and say, before this point belonged to one civilization, after this point belonged to another. What we can say is that Derinkuyu was almost certainly layered, a place built in phases, a refuge repeatedly reimagined by people who may not even have known who first began carving beneath their homes. And that changes the question. Instead of asking, who built Derinkuyu? Singular. Maybe we should ask, who kept building it? Who looked at an old chamber and saw the beginning of something larger? Who inherited a hidden passage and decided it needed a stone door? Who descended into darkness during another age of danger and understood that survival sometimes depends on what the people before you left behind? Byzantine Christians were among the last great shapers of Derinkuyu, but they were almost certainly not the first. And to understand why they needed this inherited underground world so badly, we have to return to the surface, to the empires, frontiers, armies, and invasions that made Cappadocia a place where disappearing underground could mean the difference between life and death. Cappadocia had always been a crossroads, but under the Romans and later the Byzantines, it became something even more important: a frontier. A place between worlds. By the 1st century AD, Cappadocia had been absorbed into the Roman Empire. Its old kingdoms, local traditions, and Anatolian languages did not simply vanish overnight. Rome rarely erased a landscape completely. It built on what was already there. Roads were improved, taxes were collected, garrisons appeared. Cities were tied more tightly to imperial administration, and the region became part of the enormous system that linked the Mediterranean to Syria, Mesopotamia, Armenia, and beyond. That connection brought wealth, it also brought danger. Because Cappadocia was not sitting quietly at the centre of a protected empire. It was positioned near routes armies could use. When Rome fought Eastern powers, troops moved through Anatolia. When borders shifted, frontier regions felt it first. Local people learned a lesson that would remain true for centuries. A road can bring merchants, the same road can bring an army. Then, in the 4th century, the Roman world began changing in a way that would transform Cappadocia above ground and below it. Christianity moved from a persecuted faith to an officially favoured one. Churches multiplied. Bishops gained influence. Religious communities organised themselves across towns, villages, and rural estates. Cappadocia became one of the great Christian landscapes of the Eastern Mediterranean. This was the world of Caesarea, modern Kayseri, one of the region's major urban centres. It was the world of Basil of Caesarea, the 4th century bishop and theologian whose ideas helped shape Christian monastic life for centuries, along with figures like Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa. He became one of the famous Cappadocian fathers. Their writings mattered far beyond Anatolia, but their world was rooted here, in this strange volcanic country of valleys, cliffs, cones, and soft stone. And Christian communities did something remarkable with that stone. They carved churches directly into cliff faces. They cut chapels into hidden valleys. They created monasteries, refectories, storerooms, cells, burial chambers, and places of retreat. Across Cappadocia, the landscape slowly became a religious map written into the rock. Today, places like the Gurim Valleys preserve part of that world. You can walk through chambers where walls were shaped into arches, apses, columns, and domes. You can find painted churches where biblical scenes still survive after centuries in darkness. Christ, saints, angels, bishops, martyrs, all appearing on walls inside mountains that, from the outside, barely look inhabited. It is one of the reasons Cappadocia feels almost unreal. The ground itself became architecture, but this does not mean every underground chamber was a monastery, or every tunnel was built for Christians. That would be replacing one oversimplified origin story with another. What the Byzantine period gives us is something more solid. It gives us a time when the region's Christian population was large, organised, and deeply familiar with rock-cut construction. It gives us a period when communities had both the need and the ability to adapt existing underground spaces on a major scale. And it gives us archaeological features inside Derinkuyu that fit especially well with late antique and medieval Christian use. Some spaces appear to have served religious functions. There are areas interpreted as chapels or churches. There are communal rooms, storage areas, stables, wells, ventilation shafts, and defensive passages arranged in a system far beyond what one household would need. The city was not just a hole in the ground where a few families could wait out a bad night. It was infrastructure, a hidden settlement designed for repeated use. And this is where the idea of construction phases becomes essential. Imagine entering Derinkuyu in the Byzantine era. You descend through a passage your grandparents knew. Maybe their grandparents knew it too. But nobody can say for certain who first cut it. The doorway has been widened, the floor has been lowered. An older storage chamber now connects to a newer corridor. A ventilation shaft once serving a small group of rooms now reaches several levels below. A rough chamber has been reshaped into something more organized, more defensible, more capable of holding people during a crisis. That is how an underground city grows. Not necessarily through one giant project. Through pressure. A local threat leads to one new passage. A larger population requires another chamber. A season of insecurity creates the need for more grain storage. A raid exposes a weak entrance, so a stone door is added. A religious community needs a place to gather, so an existing room is modified. Over generations, practical decisions accumulate beneath the surface. The result is not a clean blueprint, it is an archaeological palimpsest. A manuscript written, erased, and written again. The Byzantines inherited a region with memories far older than Byzantium itself. They lived among Roman roads, ancient villages, old trade routes, abandoned sites, and rock-cut spaces whose first makers may have belonged to cultures already half forgotten. They did not need to invent the idea of using the earth for shelter. Cappadocia had been teaching that lesson for centuries. What they may have done was scale it up. They expanded what was useful. They connected what had been separate. They reinforced entrances, increased capacity, and adapted chambers to the needs of Christian communities living in an increasingly unstable frontier zone. And unlike the Hittite, Phrygian, or Persian possibilities, Byzantine period use is supported by the broader historical context surrounding Derinkuyu. We know Christian Cappadocia was full of rock-cut architecture. We know communities here used carved spaces for worship, residence, storage, and retreat. We know the region faced severe military pressure in the early medieval centuries. And we know the underground cities were suited to exactly the kind of temporary concealment and survival that such pressure demanded. That does not mean every level of Derinkuyu dates to the Byzantine period. It means this is one of the clearest phases in which the underground city makes historical sense as a heavily used refuge. Byzantine Cappadocia was Christian, connected, productive, and culturally vibrant. It was also vulnerable, and the same landscape that gave its people secluded churches and monasteries gave them something else. A way to vanish, because beyond Cappadocia's valleys, powerful forces were moving. Empires were colliding. Raiding parties were crossing frontiers. And for thousands of people living above these tunnels, the warning of approaching danger may have triggered the same urgent decision again and again. Take the children, gather the food, move the animals, seal the doors, go underground. But once the doors were sealed, what exactly were they hiding from? That is the central question. Not whether danger existed. Danger was everywhere in the ancient and medieval world. Drought could ruin a harvest. Disease could move through a village. A harsh winter could kill livestock. Political collapse could turn a familiar road into a route for armed men. The question is more specific. What kind of danger would make an entire community prepare to disappear underground? Because Derinkuyu was not built for one frightened family. Its chambers, storage rooms, wells, animal spaces, ventilation shafts, and defensive bottlenecks point to something much larger. This was a place where people expected to bring supplies, bring animals, bring children, and stay long enough for the crisis above ground to pass. That changes the calculation. There is a huge difference between a shelter and a hidden city. If you're escaping a sudden storm, you need a roof, water, and maybe a fire. If you are escaping an army, you need food that will last. You need places for animals because animals mean milk, meat, transport, and wealth. You need ventilation for hundreds, perhaps thousands of people breathing in enclosed spaces. You need water that cannot be poisoned or cut off by whoever is waiting outside. You need sanitation, storage, communication, order. And you need doors. Not ordinary doors. Not doors meant to keep out wind, dust, or curious strangers. You need massive rolling stone doors that can seal a narrow tunnel from the inside, turning every passage into a choke point. You need a design where an intruder cannot simply rush forward with a sword. They have to squeeze through darkness, negotiate sharp turns, force open barriers, and enter spaces where defenders know every corner. That is why the architecture matters so much. Derinkuyu does not look like a place designed primarily to survive nature. It looks like a place designed to keep people out. The city's defensive features do not prove that every crisis involved war. Archaeology rarely gives us that kind of certainty. A stone door cannot tell us the name of the enemy standing on the other side. It cannot tell us whether the people below were hiding for 2 days, 2 weeks, or an entire season. But it tells us what they feared: human beings, organized, determined, potentially violent human beings. And that opens up several possibilities. The most obvious is warfare. Cappadocia sat in a region repeatedly affected by conflict between larger powers. Armies crossed Anatolia, borders moved, empires rose and fractured. A settlement did not need to be directly on a battlefield to suffer. Soldiers needed food, horses needed fodder, commanders demanded taxes. Retreating armies looted, victorious armies looted too. Then there were raids. Raids are different from conquest. An invading empire may want to control a city, tax its people, and keep the roads functioning. Raiders often want speed: livestock, grain, captives, portable wealth. They arrive with little warning, strike vulnerable settlements, and leave before an organized defense can respond. For villagers on the Cappadocian plateau, that kind of threat could be terrifyingly practical. You might see smoke on the horizon, hear riders coming down the road, receive a warning from a neighbouring settlement that armed men had crossed the valley, and then there would be no time for a formal evacuation plan. No walls high enough to protect everyone, no army arriving by nightfall. There would only be the roots beneath your feet, but warfare and raiding are not the only theories. Some people have suggested that underground cities offered protection during periods of religious persecution. Cappadocia became one of the great Christian regions of the Eastern Empire, and underground spaces could certainly serve religious communities seeking privacy, retreat, or safety. Chapels and religious features within the wider rock-cut landscape show that faith was deeply woven into life here. Still, persecution alone may not explain Derinkuyu's full scale. A small hidden chapel makes sense for worship in dangerous times. A network with animal stalls, enormous storage capacity, defensive doors and space for a population in the thousands suggests a broader emergency. Religious danger may have been part of the story in particular periods. But the underground city seems built for a community facing threats to its survival, not simply threats to its rituals. Political instability offers another answer. When imperial authority weakens, danger does not always arrive wearing the uniform of a foreign army. Sometimes it comes from local warlords, rival factions, tax collectors, rebels, deserters, or displaced populations moving through the countryside. A village can become unsafe even when no official war has been declared. The state may still exist on paper, but if it cannot protect roads, defend harvests, or punish violence, people must create their own systems of survival. Derinkuyu may have been one of those systems, and then there is environmental stress. Cappadocia is beautiful, but it is not gentle. Its agriculture depended on rainfall, seasons, stored grain, and the health of livestock. Drought could create hunger. Hunger could create migration. Migration could create conflict. A bad harvest did not automatically send people underground, but environmental pressure could make every other danger worse. That is important. History does not usually give us one clean cause. A drought does not have to be the direct reason a community hides below ground. It may be the reason raiders begin moving. It may weaken local defences. It may drive desperate groups towards settled farmland. It may turn a tense frontier into a violent one. So the real answer may not be one enemy. It may be a chain reaction, climate stress, food shortages, political weakness, raids, invasion, fear, and beneath all of it, a city waiting in the dark. But theories are easy. The harder task is testing them. Which threats match the periods when Derinkuyu was expanded? Which ones fit the defensive architecture? Which ones explain the storage, the ventilation, the wells, and the ability to shelter people for more than a single night? To answer that, we have to move from the possibility of danger to the enemies most likely to have made Cappadocia vanish underground. For centuries, Cappadocia lived in the shadow of an empire at war. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, controlled Anatolia from Constantinople on maps that made Cappadocia part of a powerful Christian state. But maps can be deceptive. A province may belong to an empire and still be dangerously exposed. Cappadocia sat deep in central Anatolia, on the roads linking the imperial heartland to the mountain passes of the Taurus Range. Beyond those passes lay Syria, Mesopotamia, and the lands controlled by successive Islamic caliphates. When armies moved north from Syria into Anatolia, or Byzantine forces moved south, the countryside between them became a zone of danger. Not always a battlefield, sometimes something worse. A place where no one knew when the next raid would come. Beginning in the 7th century, Arab-Byzantine warfare transformed much of Anatolia. This was not one short conflict with a clear beginning and end. It was a long struggle between major powers, lasting for generations. Armies campaigned across frontier regions, fortresses changed hands. Cities were attacked, defended, abandoned, rebuilt. And between the big campaigns came smaller, faster operations. Raids designed to seize supplies, animals, captives, and anything else worth carrying away. For people in a fortified city, a raid was dangerous. For people in an open village, it could be catastrophic. Imagine the problem from the perspective of a farming community on the Cappadocian Plateau. Your wealth is visible. It is your grain in storage. Your sheep and goats, your horses, your tools, your winter supplies. Your children. You cannot pack any of that onto a cart and outrun mounted raiders. You cannot build stone walls around every field and every hamlet. And even if there is a fortress somewhere nearby, getting everyone there in time may be impossible. So you need warning, someone watching the roads, a signal from a neighbouring settlement, a rider arriving breathless with news that armed men have crossed the mountains, or that smoke has been seen beyond the ridge. Then you need somewhere to go, not somewhere merely safe from rain or cold. Somewhere hidden enough that a passing force might never find it. Somewhere defensible enough that, if they did find an entrance, they could not simply force their way through. Somewhere with food, water, animals, and air. That is where Derinkuyu begins to make a terrible kind of sense. The underground city was not a castle in the usual sense. It did not stand on a hill visible for miles, daring an enemy to attack. It did the opposite. It concealed the population, reduced the visible signs of life, and forced any intruder into narrow, confusing passages where numbers and speed meant almost nothing. A raiding party depends on momentum. It wants to arrive fast, take what it can, and leave before defenders organise or a larger force responds. Derinkuyu turned that calculation inside out. If the villagers, their supplies, and perhaps some of their animals disappeared below ground, the raiders could search houses, seize what had been left behind, and still fail to capture the community itself. And captives mattered. In frontier warfare, people were not just collateral damage. They could be taken, ransomed, enslaved, exchanged, or used as political leverage. The fear was not simply that an enemy would burn your house. It was that they would find you inside it. This is why concealment may have been as important as defence. The rolling stone doors are dramatic, but a sealed door only works after people have reached it. The first layer of survival was knowing when to vanish. The second was making the underground routes difficult to identify, difficult to enter, and almost impossible to navigate without local knowledge. Byzantine sources describe a world in which raiding was regular enough to shape entire regions. Some campaigns were enormous, led by commanders and backed by state power. Others were smaller attacks conducted by frontier fighters, local bands or forces exploiting a moment of weakness. The pattern could change from decade to decade, but for rural communities the uncertainty itself was part of the threat. You did not need to know the name of the commander. You only needed to know that riders might come again next spring. That recurring danger may help explain Derinkuyu's scale. A single emergency can drive people to dig a shelter. But a refuge used repeatedly, expanded over generations, can become something far more elaborate. A family adds storage. A village opens another chamber. A new route connects to an older tunnel. More ventilation is needed. More wells. More places for animals. More barriers in case the enemy has learned where the entrances are. Over time, the shelter becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure preserves memory. Children would grow up knowing which passage led to the storage rooms, which shaft carried fresh air, which doors had to be sealed first, which spaces belonged to which families. The underground city would not be an abstract emergency plan. It will be part of community life, maintained because everyone understood that danger was not hypothetical. It had happened before. It could happen again. But this is where caution matters. Arab Byzantine raids are one of the most commonly proposed explanations for the underground cities of Cappadocia, and the theory fits many features of Derinkuyu remarkably well. The frontier setting, the need for concealment, the defensive architecture, the storage capacity, the possibility of repeated use. All of it points in the same direction. But no inscription says this chamber was carved during a particular raid. No excavated layer gives us the name of an army that forced thousands underground. Derinkuyu was developed across a long period, and different parts may have served different communities facing different dangers. The city may not have been built for one invasion. It may have been shaped by centuries of insecurity. A place repeatedly altered by people who had learned that survival sometimes meant disappearing before the enemy arrived. And yet war was not the only reason someone might need to disappear. In a region where empires, armies, and religions collided, belief itself could become dangerous. And that raises one of the most powerful ideas attached to Derinkuyu. Maybe the people hiding underground were not fleeing an army at all. Maybe they were fleeing because of what they believed. The popular story goes like this. Early Christians in Cappadocia were persecuted by the Roman Empire. Their faith was illegal. Their meetings were dangerous. Soldiers, informers, and hostile officials could appear without warning. So Christians carved vast underground refuges where entire communities could worship in secret, protect their families, and wait for the danger to pass. It is a compelling story, a hidden city beneath the earth. Narrow passages, sealed doors, underground chapels. Families gathered in darkness while an empire searched above them. And Cappadocia really was an important Christian region. By late antiquity, it produced some of the most influential figures in Christian history. Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa helped shape Christian theology in the 4th century. Monasteries later filled the valleys. Churches were cut directly into the soft volcanic rock. Frescoes covered walls inside cave sanctuaries. Christianity was not some minor footnote here. It became part of the landscape. So, when people find religious spaces inside or near the underground cities, the conclusion can feel obvious. Christians were hiding from Rome. But obvious is not the same thing as proven. The first problem is chronology. Derinkuyu was not created in a single moment. It is a layered place, expanded, altered, repaired, and reused over centuries. Some parts may be extremely old. Other features appear to belong to later periods. A Christian chapel inside an underground complex tells us that Christians used that space at some point. It does not automatically tell us that Christians dug the entire city. And it certainly does not prove they built it during a specific episode of Roman persecution. Think of it like finding a medieval church inside an ancient fortress. The church proves that medieval Christians occupied the fortress. It does not prove the fortress was originally built as a church. That distinction matters because the persecution story has a way of flattening hundreds, perhaps thousands of years into one dramatic image. Rome did persecute Christians, that much is beyond dispute. But persecution was not constant, universal, or identical across the empire. For long stretches of the first 3 centuries, Christian communities faced uncertainty rather than non-stop manhunts. Their legal position could be precarious. Local officials could punish them. Crowds could turn violent. Refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods could bring arrest, imprisonment, or execution. But the intensity of enforcement varied enormously from place to place and decade to decade. There were major empire-wide persecutions, especially under emperors such as Decius in the mid-3rd century and Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th. These were serious, frightening campaigns. Churches were destroyed. Scriptures were confiscated. Clergy and ordinary believers were pressured to sacrifice. Some people died, rather than comply. Could Christians in Cappadocia have sought temporary shelter during periods like these? Absolutely, it is plausible. A network of caves, tunnels, and hidden chambers would have offered obvious advantages to anyone targeted by the authorities. Small groups could meet discreetly. Families could avoid attention. Religious objects, food supplies, and records could be concealed. In a landscape already full of natural cavities and rock-cut spaces, moving underground would not have required some impossible leap of imagination. But plausible is a dangerous word in archaeology. Lots of things are plausible. The question is whether the evidence points there more strongly than it points somewhere else. And in Derinkuyu's case, the strongest evidence does not appear to support a simple picture of early Christians spending generations underground to escape Roman persecution. The complex is too large, too practical, too heavily organized around survival. It has storage areas, animal spaces, ventilation shafts, water access, defensive bottlenecks, and routes that seem designed to manage large numbers of people under sudden threat. That is not the architecture of a small secret congregation meeting for worship. It is the architecture of a population trying not to be captured. Religious spaces were clearly important. Faith travelled underground with the people who used Derinkuyu. A community expecting to remain below the surface for days, perhaps longer, would need more than grain and water. They would need ritual, leadership, meaning, and the sense that their world had not ended simply because they could not see the sky. But that tells us something different. It suggests that Christian communities used Derinkuyu as a refuge. Not necessarily that persecution created Derinkuyu in the first place. There is another complication. By the 4th century, Christianity had gone from a persecuted religion to an officially favoured one within the Roman Empire. After Constantine's conversion and the legalization of Christianity, the old story changes completely. Christians were no longer hiding from Roman officials because they were Christians. In the Byzantine Empire that followed, Christianity became central to political and social life. Cappadocia was not a secret Christian outpost beneath a pagan empire. It was one of the great Christian heartlands of the Eastern Roman world. And that is exactly when later use of underground refuges makes so much sense. The churches, chapels, and Christian symbols associated with Cappadocia may reflect the Byzantine centuries, when the region faced raids and invasions from outside imperial territory. The people underground could have been deeply Christian, praying in Christian spaces led by Christian clergy and hiding not from Rome, but from the enemies of a Christian empire. That is a less cinematic story, but it may be closer to reality. The persecution theory survives because it connects two things people already know. Christians were persecuted by Rome. Derinkuyu is underground. Put those together, and the narrative almost writes itself. It has fear, courage, secret worship, and a dramatic moral contrast between believers below ground and imperial power above it. Historical memory loves stories like that. Over time, a possibility becomes a tradition. A tradition becomes a fact repeated in guidebooks, documentaries, websites, and school lessons. Soon the uncertainty disappears. People stop saying, Christians may have sheltered here during persecution. They start saying, Derinkuyu was built by persecuted Christians. One word changes. May becomes was. And suddenly a theory has hardened into certainty. The real history is more complicated, but also more human. Derinkuyu may have sheltered people of different beliefs across different eras. Its earliest excavators may not have been Christian at all. Later Christian communities likely adapted and expanded spaces that were already ancient. During Byzantine times, those same underground corridors may have become places of prayer, refuge, and desperate waiting, while raiders moved through the countryside above. Faith was part of Derinkuyu's story. It was not necessarily the whole story. And if religious persecution cannot fully explain why people went underground, then we have to ask an even darker question. What if the danger was not human at all? What if the danger was not human at all? What if the people of Cappadocia went underground because the land above them had become impossible to live on? It is not a ridiculous question. Look at the region. Cappadocia is a volcanic landscape. Its valleys, cliffs, cones, and strange stone towers were created by eruptions on a colossal scale. Millions of years ago, volcanoes including Mount Erciyes, Mount Hassan and Goludar covered central Anatolia in ash, lava and debris. Layer after layer hardened into the soft rock called tuff. Then wind, rain, rivers and frost cut that rock into the landscape we see today. The famous fairy chimneys, the cave churches, the homes carved into cliffs, and eventually the cities beneath the ground. So it is easy to imagine ancient people looking at those volcanic mountains and fearing the next eruption. Maybe Derinkuyu was a bunker. Maybe thousands of people descended into its tunnels while ash darkened the sky. Earthquakes shook the earth, and lava moved across the plain. It is a dramatic theory, but the geology does not really support it. The volcanic activity that created Cappadocia's soft tuff belongs overwhelmingly to a much deeper past. These were not eruptions happening every few generations, while Derinkuyu's inhabitants watched from their fields. By the periods most commonly associated with the underground city's expansion and use, the major eruptions that shaped the region were ancient history. Mount Erciyes and Mount Hassan are volcanic mountains, yes, but there is no clear archaeological or geological evidence The Derinkuyu was built in response to an imminent volcanic catastrophe. And think about the practical problem. Underground chambers cut into soft rock might protect people from falling ash for a while. They could offer shelter from cold air and burning sunlight. But if a major eruption were close enough to threaten the settlement directly, going deeper underground would not automatically save anyone. Volcanic gases can sink into low spaces. Ash can choke ventilation shafts. Earthquakes can crack tunnels and collapse unsupported chambers. And no stone door, however massive, can stop a pyroclastic flow. Derinkuyu was an extraordinary refuge, but it was not a modern disaster bunker. That does not mean nature played no role, far from it. Cappadocia has always been a land of hard seasons. Central Anatolia sits high above sea level. Winters can be brutally cold. Snow can cover the ground. Winds move across the open plateau with very little mercy. Summers can be dry and intensely hot. Rainfall is limited and unpredictable. A bad harvest was not an inconvenience. It could become a crisis. Now imagine what the underground city offered in that world. Temperature stability. Below the surface, the rock changes the rules. Outside, the difference between a winter night and a summer afternoon can be extreme. Inside a deep rock-cut chamber, conditions remain far more even. Cool during the heat, less bitter during the cold. Not comfortable by modern standards, perhaps, but stable. And stability is survival. A family sheltering underground during a snowstorm would not need to fight the same freezing wind as people in exposed houses above. Grain stored in cool chambers would last longer. Dried food would be better protected from heat, moisture, and pests. Wine, oil, and other provisions could be kept in conditions far more reliable than a surface storeroom offered. That matters because Derinkuyu was not just a maze of hiding places. It contained storage rooms. It had spaces associated with animals. It had wells, shafts, kitchens, and places where people could process food. Those features make sense in a landscape where survival depended on planning ahead. A good harvest had to carry you through a bad winter. A full storage jar had to carry you through drought. And a protected underground space could turn food into time. That is the key. Not luxury, not comfort. Time. If raiders destroyed the crops, stored grain bought time. If snow blocked roads, underground shelter bought time. If drought reduced the harvest, protected supplies bought time. In a pre-modern world where one failed season could ripple through an entire community, the ability to preserve food and wait out hardship was enormously valuable. But there is an important limit to this idea. Derinkuyu does not look like it was built mainly for ordinary winter living. If cold weather were the central problem, why the defensive stone doors? Why the narrow tunnels designed to force people through one at a time? Why the bottlenecks, concealed routes and entrances that could be sealed from within? Why build a refuge that seems so concerned with controlling who gets in? Winter does not try to force open a door. Drought does not send scouts down a tunnel. A volcanic eruption does not need to be delayed at a choke point while defenders attack from the other side. Those features point back toward a human threat. Nature may explain why going underground was practical. The climate gave people every reason to value stable temperatures, protected storage and sheltered living space. The volcanic tuff made excavation unusually possible. The landscape itself almost invited people to carve rooms, tunnels, cellars, sanctuaries, and eventually far larger complexes beneath their homes. But practicality alone does not explain Derinkuyu's defensive character. The best answer may be that the city served more than one purpose at once. In normal times, underground rooms could store food, protect valuable supplies, shelter animals, and help households endure Cappadocia's punishing seasonal extremes. In dangerous times, those same rooms could become a refuge. The granaries became emergency provisions, the wells became lifelines. The cool chambers became places where families waited in darkness, and the stone doors became the boundary between safety below and terror above. That is how great survival architecture often works. It is not built for one disaster, it is built to make a community harder to break. A drought could strain it, a winter could test it. But an invasion could activate the whole system, and Derinkuyu was not alone. Beneath Cappadocia, evidence suggests there were other hidden places, other tunnels, other underground settlements, not one isolated city waiting for a single catastrophe, but a network spread across the region, an entire landscape prepared to disappear. And that changes everything, because once you stop looking at Derinkuyu as a single underground city and start looking at Cappadocia as an underground landscape, the scale of the idea becomes almost hard to grasp. Derinkuyu was not alone beneath the plateau. Just a short distance away lies Cappadocia, another vast underground settlement carved into the same soft volcanic tuff. It is smaller in its explored extent than Derinkuyu, but smaller is a dangerous word here. Cappadocia contains multiple levels of rooms, storage areas, kitchens, stables, ventilation shafts, churches, and defensive passages. Like Derinkuyu, it was not a cave in the casual sense. It was an engineered refuge, expanded and altered over generations. And Cappadocia is only the beginning. Across Cappadocia, archaeologists have identified dozens of underground settlements. Some are little more than enlarged cellars, hidden rooms, or short defensive tunnels beneath villages. Others are major complexes with deep shafts, heavy stone doors, animal quarters, food storage, and spaces large enough to shelter entire communities. Places like Ozkonak, Marzi, Tatlarin, Gaziemir, and many smaller sites scattered through the region. The exact number depends on what you count. There are famous excavated cities open to visitors. There are partly explored systems beneath modern villages. There are collapsed entrances, blocked shafts, and private underground spaces that may connect to much older structures. Some estimates speak of more than 100 subterranean settlements. Others go higher into the hundreds, if every carved refuge, storage complex, and underground neighbourhood is included. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Cappadocia's underground world is still not fully mapped. Think about what that means. Above ground, cities reveal themselves. Roads, walls, foundations, temples, cemeteries, towers. You can survey them from a hilltop. You can photograph them from the air. But underground, the evidence hides beneath houses, fields, courtyards, mosques, shops, and modern streets. A chamber might be sealed behind a wall in someone's basement. A tunnel might have collapsed 1,000 years ago. A shaft might be covered by a building whose owners have no idea what lies below. And in Cappadocia, people have been carving into the rock for so long that the layers overlap. A room used as a cellar in the 19th century may have begun as a medieval storeroom. A medieval storeroom may have been cut into a much older passage. A tunnel originally made for shelter could later become a stable, a granary, a wine press, or simply a place to keep potatoes cool through the summer. So when people ask, how many underground cities are there? The honest answer is, we do not fully know, but we know enough to see the pattern. This was not one miracle of excavation. It was a regional survival strategy. And then there is the claim that makes the whole thing even more extraordinary. For decades, guides, local accounts and popular histories have repeated that Derinkuyu and Cappadocia were connected by a tunnel stretching roughly 8 kilometers underground. Imagine that, a passage running beneath the Cappadocian plateau, allowing people to move from one hidden city to another without ever returning to the surface. Not just a refuge, a concealed transportation system. It is an irresistible image. Families fleeing one settlement as raiders approached, messengers carrying warnings through darkness, supplies moving between underground strongholds, a whole population vanishing below the earth, then shifting from one protected centre to another, while the invaders above searched empty villages. And there is a reason the story has survived. Long tunnels do exist in Cappadocia. Underground settlements often include passages leading away from central chambers. Some may have connected neighbourhoods, homes, storage spaces, wells, or separate entrances. Others may have extended toward nearby settlements, in a landscape of soft rock, where generations kept digging, enlarging, repairing, and repurposing old spaces. Such connections are entirely plausible. But plausible is not the same as proven. The famous Derinkuyu to Kaimakli tunnel has not been fully excavated, surveyed, and demonstrated as a continuous 8-kilometre route that people could reliably travel from one city to the other. Much of what may lie between known sections is blocked, collapsed, flooded, unstable, or inaccessible. Some passages may be natural fractures enlarged by human hands. Some may be short local routes later woven into a much larger legend. And some reported connections may simply reflect the fact that underground architecture in this region is everywhere. You find one tunnel beneath one village, another tunnel beneath the next. Over time, people begin to imagine the spaces joining. Sometimes they may be right, but archaeology requires more than imagination. To prove a link, researchers need continuous physical evidence, mapped passages, matching levels, datable construction phases, and routes that can actually be traced through the rock. Without that, the giant network remains a possibility, not a confirmed fact. Still, even the cautious version is astonishing. Derinkuyu did not need a direct tunnel to Kaimakli to belong to a network. A network does not always mean one continuous corridor. It can mean communities built around the same strategy, villages that knew where the hidden entrances were, families that had relatives in neighbouring settlements, religious communities that shared information, farmers who stored grain in protected chambers, lookouts who could spot danger on the plateau and send word ahead, people who knew that if one refuge was compromised, another lay beyond the next ridge. That kind of network could function above ground and below it. Picture Cappadocia during a period of danger. Not every village has to descend at once. A raid is reported on one road. Nearby settlements hear the warning. Some people retreat into their own underground spaces. Others move livestock, grain, tools and children toward a larger refuge. A church community might shelter in one complex. Farmers from scattered hamlets might gather in another. Defenders close the stone doors. Wells are checked. Food is rationed. Ventilation shafts are guarded. The region does not disappear into one city. It disappears into many, and that changes what Derinkuyu's scale means. If Derinkuyu truly housed thousands of people during emergencies, it may not have been serving only the village directly above it. It may have been a regional stronghold, a place where people from smaller settlements gathered when the threat was too large for a household cellar or a local tunnel system. Its deep levels, large storage capacity, animal spaces, religious rooms, and defensive passages begin to look less like the private shelter of one community and more like infrastructure for a wider population. A refuge designed not merely to hide people, a refuge designed to absorb them. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the underground cities were not centrally organized at all. Perhaps no ruler ordered a grand defensive network. Perhaps there was no master plan, no regional command center, no underground highway stretching from city to city. Instead, each generation learned from the last. One village cut deeper because its neighbours had done the same. One family added a storage room, another opened an escape route. A church was carved, a stone door was installed. Then, centuries later, someone expanded the passage again. Not one enormous construction project, 1,000 acts of fear, preparation, memory, and survival. That may be even more haunting, because it means Cappadocia's underground world was not created in a single moment of terror. It was built slowly, through repeated encounters with insecurity. Every blocked entrance may record a lesson. Every storage room may remember a season when food was scarce. Every narrow tunnel may preserve the memory of people who believed danger could come without warning. Derinkuyu was vast, but it may have been only one node in a hidden civilization beneath the earth. And if that is true, the question is no longer simply, what were they hiding from? The question becomes much darker. What kind of world makes entire communities decide that safety is not behind a wall, not beyond a gate, but deep underground in darkness with the stone door closed behind them? And once that stone door rolled into place, the real test began. Not the test of getting underground, the test of living there. Because Derinkuyu can feel almost unreal when we describe it as architecture. Levels, shafts, tunnels, churches, stables, storage rooms. Defensive doors, it sounds like an ancient machine built to keep a population alive beneath the earth. But machines are only as good as the people operating them. And people are difficult to keep alive in darkness. Picture the first hours after an alarm. Families come down through narrow passages carrying whatever they can manage. Children, blankets, sacks of grain, water jars, oil lamps, tools, maybe a few precious possessions that can be carried in one hand. Behind them come animals, pushed reluctantly into underground stalls. Goats, sheep, cattle, perhaps donkeys. Animals that provided milk, labour, meat, hides, and wealth above ground. But below ground became another problem to solve. Then the entrance closes. The daylight disappears. For the people inside, Derinkuyu would not have felt like a grand underground city. Most of the time it would have felt cramped, uneven, cold in some places, stuffy in others. The rock walls would have held moisture. Footsteps would echo through corridors. Voices from rooms beyond sight would carry strangely through the tunnels, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, sometimes swallowed completely by the maze. And darkness would have been everywhere. Not absolute darkness, at least not while lamps were burning. But firelight creates its own kind of world. A small oil lamp does not illuminate a chamber. It pushes back a tiny circle of blackness. Faces appear and vanish. Smoke climbs toward the ceiling. Shadows stretch along the walls. In a passage only wide enough for one person, the flame of the person ahead may be the only thing keeping you from placing your hand against cold rock and realizing you have no idea where the tunnel leads. Derinkuyu's ventilation system was extraordinary. Its shafts brought air deep into the complex, and some may have doubled as wells. But ventilation is not the same thing as comfort. A large hidden population, burning lamps, cooking food, tending animals, and breathing in confined rooms would have changed the air quickly. Smoke from hearths and lamps would have been a constant concern. Even with shafts drawing air through the system, the smell must have been overwhelming. Smoke, damp, stone, wool, leather, human sweat, animal manure, stored grain, ash, food cooking in enclosed spaces. This was survival, not a subterranean paradise. And then there was noise. Thousands of people do not become silent simply because they are hiding. Babies cry. Animals panic. Someone coughs. Someone drops a jar. A child gets lost. A family argues over food. A frightened person asks whether the danger has passed. Somewhere, a priest may be praying. Somewhere else, men may be waiting beside a sealed doorway, listening for movement on the other side. but the community would have needed silence when it mattered. That may be one reason Derinkuyu's internal organisation is so important. It was not just a collection of holes in the ground. The spaces appear to have been arranged for different functions: storage, food preparation, animal keeping, worship, living, movement, defence. That separation was practical. You do not want livestock blocking the path to a water source. You do not want cooking smoke trapped beside sleeping families. You do not want everyone crowding the same passage when a stone door needs to be sealed. A refuge of this scale required rules. Who gets food first? Who maintains the lamps? Who carries water? Who cleans the animal areas? Who watches the entrances? Who decides whether the people can return to the surface? Who has authority when panic spreads through a chamber full of exhausted families? We do not have a written rulebook from Derinkuyu. No surviving schedule tells us which family swept which corridor or how grain was rationed during a siege. But the architecture itself suggests coordination. Large groups cannot function underground by accident. Someone had to know where supplies were kept. Someone had to organise labour. Someone had to make sure the ventilation shafts remained open, the wells usable, the passages clear, and the waste moved away from living spaces. And waste was not a small detail. Every human community produces it. Every animal produces more. In an enclosed refuge, sanitation can become a threat almost as dangerous as an army outside. Waste needed to be carried through those narrow corridors, probably to designated pits, shafts, or disposal areas. Water had to be protected from contamination. Food had to be kept dry and safe from pests. Sick people had to be cared for without allowing disease to spread through crowded rooms. Imagine doing all of that by hand in flickering light, while trying not to make enough noise for enemies above to hear. Then think about the supply chain. Derinkuyu could store food, but food does not appear underground by magic. Grain had to be harvested before danger arrived. Jars had to be filled. Fuel had to be gathered. Animals had to be led down. Water had to be drawn or secured. Every sack of wheat, every amphora of oil, every bundle of firewood or dried dung fuel had to pass through entrances and corridors designed more for defence than convenience. A single person carrying a heavy jar through a low tunnel would move slowly. Now multiply that by hundreds of jars, by sacks of grain, by fodder for animals, by the daily movement of water and waste. Derinkuyu's population estimates, sometimes reaching 20,000, show what the complex may have accommodated at maximum capacity. But capacity is not the same as a comfortable permanent population, and it is not proof that 20,000 people lived there for months or years at a time. That distinction matters. Most scholars see places like Derinkuyu primarily as refuges used during periods of danger, not as fully permanent underground cities in the modern sense. People may have sheltered there for days, perhaps weeks, and in some circumstances longer. The storage rooms, wells, kitchens, and animal spaces suggest serious preparation for extended emergencies. But a vast population underground would consume food, fuel, clean water, and breathable air at an astonishing rate. The longer people stayed, the harsher the conditions became. Food supplies dwindled, animals needed feed, lamps needed oil. Smoke accumulated. Waste increased. Illness became more dangerous. Children became restless. Adults became exhausted. Even the psychological burden of no sunlight, no horizon, no fresh wind, no clear sense of time would have worn people down. Morning and night lose meaning underground. You wake when someone wakes you. You eat when rations are distributed. You wait for news. You listen. You wonder whether the people above know you are there. You wonder whether they have found the entrance. You wonder whether opening the door will save you or kill you. And yet in that darkness life continued. Bread was made, water was shared, children were comforted, prayers were spoken. Injuries were treated, watches were kept. The same people who farmed the plateau tended vineyards, raised animals, traded goods, and worshipped in sunlight became, for a time, citizens of a world beneath the ground. That is the real achievement of Derinkuyu, not that people carved deep into soft volcanic rock. It is that they created a system capable of preserving community when the surface became too dangerous to trust. But preserving a community is not the same as making it safe. Derinkuyu could keep people hidden, it could slow attackers, it could protect food, water and families long enough to outlast a raid or endure a crisis. What it could not do was make underground life easy. And that harsh reality may help explain why its deepest mystery remains unresolved. A place this elaborate was not built for an ordinary inconvenience. People do not choose darkness, crowding, smoke and fear unless the world above has given them reason to believe that staying outside is worse. That is where the evidence becomes both fascinating and frustrating. Derinkuyu tells us an enormous amount through its tunnels, shafts, chambers, doors and worn passages. It tells us that people expected danger. It tells us they planned for it. It tells us they understood the rock beneath Cappadocia well enough to turn it into a defensive system on a scale that still feels almost impossible. But Derinkuyu does not tell us everything. It does not give us a single founding date carved neatly above an entrance. It does not leave behind a signed blueprint saying, "This level was built by these people in this year for this enemy." It does not settle the argument over exactly how many people could shelter inside or for exactly how long. And those questions matter. Who began the first underground chambers? Some scholars connect the earliest phases to ancient Anatolian communities, possibly going back to the Hittite period or even earlier. Others are more cautious. The rock-cut spaces were expanded, altered, reused, and connected across centuries. A small early refuge could have become a larger one. A storage chamber could become a stable. A tunnel cut for one crisis could be widened for another. By the Byzantine era, Derinkuyu was clearly part of a deeply developed underground landscape shaped by Christian communities living on a dangerous frontier. But identifying the first people to put a tool into the rock is much harder. The problem is that soft volcanic tuff is easy to reshape. Later builders can erase earlier surfaces. A new doorway can cut through an old chamber wall. A passage can be blocked, reopened, widened, or redirected. Organic materials that could be dated directly, wood, cloth, rope, food remains, rarely survive in the conditions archaeologists need. And even when a room contains pottery or other artifacts, those objects may date the last people who used the room, not the first people who created it. It is like entering a house that has been renovated for 2,000 years. The newest floor tells you something. So does the oldest wall. But neither one automatically explains every generation in between. Capacity is another mystery. You will often hear that Derinkuyu held 20,000 people. Sometimes the number rises even higher when animals and supplies are included. It is possible that during an extreme emergency, a very large population crowded into the accessible levels. But these estimates are not a head count. They are calculations based on available space, rooms, storage areas, and assumptions about how tightly people could shelter. And as we have already seen, surviving underground is not just about fitting bodies into chambers. It is about water, food, air, fuel, sanitation, disease, animal fodder, the ability to move through the tunnels without creating panic. A complex might physically hold thousands for a short time, while being unable to sustain that same number for weeks. So when we say Derinkuyu may have sheltered 20,000 people, The honest answer is that we are describing a possibility, not claiming a proven permanent population. Then there is the question of duration. Were families hiding for a night during a raid? Several days, weeks during a siege? Did some people remain below ground seasonally or during repeated waves of violence? The architecture proves preparation for more than a brief panic. Storage rooms, water access, kitchens, churches, animal stalls, and defensive doors all point to serious endurance. But architecture alone cannot give us a calendar. That uncertainty leaves room for imagination. And imagination has rushed in. Online, Derinkuyu is often presented as evidence of aliens, a lost civilization, secret technologies, or an ancient society with knowledge so advanced that conventional history cannot explain it. The city is real. Its scale is real. The engineering is real. That is precisely why these stories spread so easily. People see a complex underground world and assume ordinary human beings could not possibly have made it. But mystery is not proof. Not knowing exactly when a passage was first cut does not mean it was cut by aliens. Not knowing every stage of construction does not prove a vanished super-civilization. And the fact that ancient people achieved something difficult does not mean they possessed impossible technology. In fact, the documented explanation is more impressive. Derinkuyu was not created by one magical event. It was likely the result of accumulated knowledge, generations learning how tough behaves, where it can be carved safely, which shafts draw air, which tunnels can be defended, how to shape stone doors that roll into place, how to organize food, animals, water, worship, and escape routes beneath a landscape threatened by war and instability. That is not a lesser story. That is the story of human intelligence working slowly, collectively, and under pressure. No laser-cut walls are needed, no forgotten machines, no visitors from another world, just skilled labour, simple tools, local geology, careful planning, and communities desperate enough to keep expanding the refuge their ancestors had begun. And the next discoveries may bring us closer to the truth. More detailed mapping could reveal sealed passages, construction phases, and connections between Derinkuyu and neighbouring underground sites. Ground-penetrating radar, 3D laser scanning, and other non-invasive surveys may help identify voids too dangerous or inaccessible to explore directly. Microscopic study of tool marks could distinguish different carving methods. Sediment samples, charcoal, pollen, pottery, animal bones, and mineral deposits may help date periods of use more precisely. Even ancient DNA from protected deposits, if any survives, could someday reveal who passed through these chambers. Every new excavation has the potential to sharpen the picture. But Derinkuyu may never surrender a complete answer. And perhaps that is fitting. It was built to hide people from the world above. Its deepest purpose was secrecy. Even now, after centuries of exploration, it still keeps part of that secret in the dark. And that brings us back to the most unsettling image of all. Above Derinkuyu, there are roads, homes, fields, shops, and the ordinary rhythms of a town in central Turkey. People walk across the same volcanic landscape. Their ancestors crossed centuries ago. From the surface, there is little to prepare you for what lies beneath. No giant monument, no towering fortress, no warning that the ground below once opened into a hidden world of tunnels, stables, storerooms, wells, chapels, kitchens, and narrow passages leading down into darkness. A city prepared for the moment when ordinary life became impossible. That is the strongest conclusion the evidence allows. Derinkuyu was almost certainly not built as an underground curiosity, a ceremonial monument, or a place where thousands chose to live comfortably below ground forever. Its design is too practical, too defensive, too focused on survival. The ventilation shafts kept air moving through the depths. The wells and water systems reduced dependence on the surface. Storage spaces made it possible to bring food below. Animal areas protected valuable livestock. Churches and communal rooms preserved social and religious life. And then there are the stone doors, massive circular slabs positioned to seal passages from within, turning familiar tunnels into barriers that an attacker would struggle to cross. Every feature points toward a single brutal reality. The people who expanded this place expected that danger might come with little warning. They expected to need somewhere secure, somewhere hidden, somewhere that could hold families, animals, supplies, and an entire community long enough for the threat above to pass. And human danger is still the most convincing explanation. Cappadocia stood in a region crossed by armies, contested by empires, exposed to raids, invasions, political collapse, and religious conflict. Over many centuries, people living here had good reason to fear what could appear over the horizon. Mounted raiders, hostile soldiers, plundering forces or authorities who could make life above ground unsafe. The underground cities were not necessarily built for one enemy, one war, or one single historical catastrophe. They make more sense as refuges repeatedly adapted for recurring crisis. That distinction matters. Derinkuyu may have begun as a far smaller system. A few carved chambers, a storage space, a hiding place. Perhaps a shelter created by ancient Anatolian communities whose names and motives are now lost. Later generations inherited those spaces, altered them, and pushed deeper. When new dangers appeared, they added new rooms, new tunnels, new defences. By the Byzantine period, the complex had become part of a much larger underground culture, one shaped by communities that understood both the land and the threats surrounding them. So the city was not frozen in time. It evolved, and that may be why its origins remain so difficult to pin down. Derinkuyu is less like a building constructed in a single generation and more like a living memory carved into stone. Each generation received what the last had made, then changed it for its own fears. But imagine what that required. Not just tools, not just labour, trust to carve an underground sanctuary. People had to believe that their neighbours would help when the danger came. Someone had to dig the shafts. Someone had to haul away the rubble. Someone had to maintain the doors, store grain, tend animals, carry water, remember the routes, and make room for children, elders, and strangers arriving in panic. They had to agree across years and perhaps centuries that this work was worth doing even when no enemy stood at the gates. That is the real scale of Derinkuyu. It is not measured only in meters below the earth, or in the estimated number of people who might have crowded inside. It is measured in generations of shared effort, in the collective decision to prepare for the unthinkable, in the refusal to let one raid, one invasion, or one season of terror erase an entire community. And perhaps that is why the place still feels so powerful. The tunnels are silent now. The stone doors no longer roll shut against frightened hands. The chambers are empty of smoke, livestock whispered prayers, and families waiting for news from the world above. But the question remains, what did it mean to hear danger approaching across the open land, to gather what you could carry, to lead your family toward a hidden entrance, and to descend step by step into the darkness, trusting that the world beneath your feet would keep you alive? If this journey into Derinkuyu made you see history differently, please like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And tell us again, where are you listening from? The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.